All stories posted on our channel are stories from our subscribers and created by us based on real events we've experienced and witnessed. We post new stories every day for your entertainment, that we hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't one argument, one decisive moment that marked the shift. It was gradual, like warmth leaving a room in winter, so subtle at first that I didn't notice until I could see my breath. For years, I thought silence was just part of the rhythm of marriage, that familiar quiet that settles after the first rush fades. But this wasn't that. This was colder, deliberate, designed. My name is Daniel, and I've been married to Claire for 7 years. We live in a small 2-story house on the outskirts of Denver, the kind of neighborhood where lawns are neatly trimmed and people wave but never ask questions. On the outside, we look like the kind of couple who's figured it out. Stable jobs, nice car, dinner on the table most nights. But what people don't see are the pauses between our words, the way she turns off the light and rolls to her side before I even climb into bed. It started after something small, a disagreement about money, or maybe about how I forgot to pick her up from work one rainy afternoon. I can't even recall exactly what triggered it, because that's how her punishments always began, quietly. No shouting, no dramatic ultimatums, just distance. At first she'd withhold affection, no hugs before work, no small touches while passing each other in the kitchen. Then the silence stretched into something heavier, something with intent. When I'd reach for her hand in bed, she'd pull away gently, wordlessly. That gentle avoidance was more painful than anger. Anger at least had noise. This was pure absence. The first time she said no to intimacy, it was with a tone that sounded almost reasonable. "I'm tired, Daniel," she said. "It's been a long week." I nodded, of course. I didn't want to push. I understood that exhaustion is real, that people need space. But weeks turned into months, and every attempt at closeness felt like I was knocking on a door she'd locked from the inside. When I tried to talk about it, she'd sigh and change the subject. One night, as we were watching TV, I finally asked, "Claire, did I do something wrong?" She didn't look away from the screen. "Why does everything have to be about you?" That cut deeper than she knew. Because until then, I'd thought maybe it was about me, that I could fix it if I just tried harder, if I just loved her better. But that sentence, tossed so casually, made me realize this wasn't about fixing anything. It was about control. Over time, intimacy became a negotiation, something she granted or denied based on her mood. If I said the wrong thing, if I questioned her decisions, the door closed again. I began to live in a constant state of apology, even when I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The house changed too. The kitchen, once alive with conversation and music, became quiet. We ate dinner across from each other, our plates clinking like distant bells. Her phone was always near her hand, her attention half elsewhere. Sometimes she'd smile at a text, a soft, private smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I started spending more time at work, staying late under the excuse of deadlines. It wasn't that I loved my job more than her. I just couldn't bear walking into that stillness every evening. Even the air in our home felt heavy, thick with the things we didn't say. When we did talk, it was transactional, bills, chores, schedules, conversations stripped of warmth, like reading a list out loud. One night I tried to bridge the distance with humor. I'd found an old photo of us on my phone, taken on our first vacation to California. We were at the beach, laughing, sunburned, ridiculous. I showed it to her while we were lying in bed. "Remember this?" I said, smiling at the memory. She glanced at the screen, expression flat. "Yeah, I remember," she said, turning away. That was all. I stared at the back of her head, the quiet shape of her shoulders under the blanket. The space between us felt like an ocean. I used to think love could survive anything. Fatigue, arguments, boredom, but I'd never imagined it could suffocate under silence. That's what she weaponized best. Her ability to withhold, to make me feel invisible without ever raising her voice. The human need for connection is simple, primal. When the person you love deliberately denies it, You start questioning your own worth. I began to doubt my body, my tone, my very presence. I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at my reflection as though it belonged to someone else. What had I done to make her stop seeing me? There were moments, small and cruel, when I thought I saw a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, like my confusion confirmed her power. Once, during dinner, I reached across the table, lightly brushed her hand. She didn't move it away immediately, but her lips curled into a faint smirk. Then, without saying a word, she stood up, took her plate to the sink, and left the room. That night, I sat alone in the living room long after she went to bed. The television played something meaningless, a sitcom laugh track echoing through the emptiness. I muted it and listened to the quiet instead. That's when I realized how punishment can take many forms. Sometimes it's not shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it's the simple act of pretending you don't exist. I tried to reason with her more than once. "Claire," I said one Sunday morning, "we can't keep living like this." She sipped her coffee, eyes still on her phone. "Like what?" "Like strangers." She looked up then, her expression unreadable. "Maybe that's what we are, Daniel." Her tone wasn't angry. It was calm, almost gentle. That calmness hurt more than rage ever could. Rage at least meant you cared enough to feel. After that, I stopped trying for a while. I stopped asking, stopped explaining, stopped touching. I wanted to see if she'd notice, if my silence would echo back to her. It didn't. She seemed relieved, as if my surrender made things easier. That was when I knew the dynamic had changed completely. In the months that followed, I lived in that house like a ghost. I went through motions, cooked, cleaned, worked, slept. I spoke less, smiled less, felt less. I'd go entire days without hearing her voice, even though she was just a few feet away. And yet I stayed, out of habit, out of fear, maybe out of hope. Hope that she'd wake up one morning, turn to me, and remember that love isn't supposed to feel like punishment. But love, at least the way she practiced it, was a transaction. Give when it benefits her, take when it doesn't cost her. The irony is that in her quest for control, she taught me something unexpected. What it means to lose yourself trying to be seen. Every attempt to bridge the gap only made it wider, and every apology dug the hole deeper. Looking back now, I see that the first chapter of our ending wasn't written in anger. It was written in silence, a silence that stretched longer than any fight could. I thought enduring it meant strength. I thought patience would heal her coldness. But what I didn't realize then was that endurance, when met with indifference, becomes a kind of self-erasure. And once you start erasing parts of yourself to stay loved, it's only a matter of time before there's nothing left of you at all. That was the night I stopped believing that time could fix us. I didn't know it yet, but the man sitting in that quiet house, the one too afraid to walk away, was already disappearing. And in his place, someone new was quietly taking shape. Someone who would one day soon decide that love without respect is just a slow death in disguise. There's a certain day that stays burned in your memory, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. For me, it was a Tuesday. It had rained all morning, and the sky over Denver was an endless gray, heavy enough to make everything feel slower. I woke up before Claire, made coffee, and sat by the kitchen window listening to the dripping of water from the gutters. She came downstairs later, already dressed for work, her perfume faint but deliberate. She didn't look at me when she walked past. She poured herself coffee without a word, her eyes focused on her phone, thumbs gliding across the screen like she was texting someone important. I said good morning anyway. It came out smaller than I intended, quiet enough that I could have pretended I hadn't spoken at all if she didn't respond. She didn't. She just took her mug and left the room. That's when I felt it, that dull throb of realization that love had turned into routine politeness and obligation. I used to believe that silence in a marriage was natural, part of growing comfortable with someone. But this wasn't comfort. It was punishment disguised as normalcy. When you live with someone who withholds affection, you start studying every detail of their behavior, like you're trying to decode a language you never learned. I noticed everything. The subtle pauses before she answered a question, the way her smile only existed for others, how her laughter returned only when I wasn't around. It's a strange kind of loneliness, being unseen by the person who once knew your heartbeat by memory. That Tuesday night, I waited for her to come home. I'd made dinner, roasted chicken, vegetables, the kind of meal she used to love. I didn't do it to win her over. I just needed something to remind me that I was still capable of caring for her, even when she'd stopped caring for me. When she arrived, she glanced at the table and said, "I already ate." No anger, no apology, just dismissal. Then she walked past me and went straight upstairs. I heard the shower running a few minutes later. I stood there in the kitchen with the smell of food filling the air and the sound of running water above my head. It was a small sound, but it was enough to remind me how far she'd gone, how far we'd gone. I sat at the table and ate alone, forcing every bite down because I couldn't stand to waste what I'd made. Every chew felt like a metaphor, mechanical, joyless, necessary. Afterward, I went upstairs. The shower had stopped. Claire was in bed, already on her side facing the wall, the blue glow of her phone casting faint light across the sheets. I brushed my teeth in silence, turned off the bathroom light, and slid into my side of the bed. "Good night," I said softly. No answer. I stared at the ceiling for hours, counting the faint shadows moving across the room as cars passed outside. That was the moment I understood how easily indifference replaces love, not in one grand act, but in thousands of tiny choices not to care. Weeks like that blur together. You stop keeping track because each one feels the same. The house becomes less a home and more a place to survive in. She went to work earlier than she used to, stayed later, and when she was home she was somewhere else entirely. Sometimes I'd hear her laugh through the phone in another room. A sound that used to belong to me, now redirected to whoever she deemed worthy of her warmth. I tried, I really did. I planned a weekend away, thinking maybe distance from the routine would help. When I mentioned it, she didn't even look up from her laptop. "I'm busy," she said flatly. "Maybe next month." "Claire, we need this," I told her. "We haven't had a real conversation in weeks." She closed her computer, leaned back, and gave me a look I'll never forget, a mix of exhaustion and disdain. "You always make everything sound like a crisis, Daniel. I just don't feel like it. Why can't you respect that?" Respect. That word hit hard. Respect in her mouth meant obedience. It meant silence from me and permission for her. That night, lying in bed again, I thought about how desire doesn't vanish instantly. It decays, slowly, like fruit left too long on the counter. What once felt tender and alive turned soft, bitter and hollow. I found myself avoiding home after that. I'd stay late at the office, pretending to be consumed by work, when really I was just avoiding the void that waited for me there. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their questions. No one wants to admit that they're sleeping beside someone who treats them like furniture. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I ran into an old friend, Adam, a guy I used to grab drinks with before marriage started swallowing my social life. He asked how things were. I smiled, lied, said, "Good, just busy." But something in my face must have betrayed me. He didn't press, but he said something that stuck. Sometimes peace isn't found in fixing things. It's in walking away from what's already dead. That night, I went home and stood outside the house for a long time before unlocking the door. Through the living room window, I could see her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, the television muted. The light from the screen painted her face in cold blue. She looked peaceful, but not in the way that meant contentment. It was more like she was at ease in my absence. When I stepped inside, she didn't even glance up. I said hello, out of habit more than anything. She nodded without looking away from her phone. I went upstairs, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I tried to remember the last time she had touched me. Not sexually, just any touch. A hand on the shoulder, a brush against my arm, a kiss goodbye. I couldn't recall it. It had been months, maybe longer. That realization cracked something in me. It wasn't anger, Not yet. It was grief. The grief of realizing the person you love has already left you, not physically, but emotionally. She was still here, breathing the same air, sleeping under the same roof, but she had checked out long ago. The next morning, I didn't make coffee. I didn't say good morning. I dressed quietly, left for work early, and sat in the car longer than necessary, staring at the house. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It looked like a place I was renting from someone who'd stopped caring if I stayed. That day, I made a decision, a small one, but it would grow. I decided to stop chasing her warmth. I wouldn't beg for affection, wouldn't plead for explanations. I'd stop trying to decode her moods like some invisible test I could never pass. At first, she didn't notice. My withdrawal blended seamlessly into her indifference. We functioned like two strangers sharing a lease. But inside, something had shifted in me. I had stopped living on the hope of change. I'd started preparing quietly for escape. And it's strange. Once you stop begging to be loved, you start seeing the relationship for what it truly is. You see how manipulation hides behind silence, how control can wear the mask of detachment. I wasn't angry with her then. Not yet. Anger requires expectation, and I had none left. What I felt was something far heavier. The calm clarity of someone who knows the end has already begun, even if no one has spoken the words aloud. That was the real turning point, not when she stopped touching me, but when I stopped mistaking her coldness for something I deserved. I began to see that the punishment she imposed was never about intimacy. It was about power. And the moment I refused to play the game, she would lose it. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet rebellion, the decision to stop needing her approval, would become the start of my freedom. It's a strange thing, realizing that the person who once made your world feel full now makes it feel unbearably small. By the time autumn came around, Claire and I were two strangers orbiting the same space out of habit, not love. The silence between us had become routine, so constant it no longer startled me. It was like living beside a ticking clock, steady, predictable, and exhausting. The leaves had started to turn, brushing the streets of Denver in color. Our neighborhood looked picturesque. Gold trees, kids in sweaters, pumpkins on porches. You'd never guess there was a war happening inside that house. It wasn't the kind of war that left bruises or raised voices. It was the quieter kind, made of withheld glances, unanswered questions, and invisible walls. One evening I came home later than usual. My office had become my sanctuary, a sterile refuge filled with noise and purpose. I stayed late, pretending to care about deadlines, just so I wouldn't have to return to the hollow quiet that waited for me. When I finally did, I found Claire in the kitchen, scrolling through her tablet, earbuds in, half a glass of wine by her side. The moment she saw me, she took out one earbud but didn't pause her scrolling. "Hey," I said. My voice sounded foreign to me, distant, polite. "Hey," she replied without looking up. "Did you eat?" "Yeah." A one-word answer, like punctuation marking the end of a conversation that never began. I stood there, still holding my keys, realizing how absurdly normal our detachment had become. The hum of the refrigerator filled the pause between us. It was ridiculous how a machine seemed to have more life than our marriage did. I went upstairs, loosened my tie, and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. The reflection looking back wasn't angry. He just looked tired. That kind of exhaustion that seeps deeper than sleep could fix. It was the fatigue of pretending that indifference was peace, that patience was love. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of her steady breathing beside me made the silence heavier. I turned to face her, the dim streetlight casting a thin strip of gold across the sheets. Her face looked peaceful, almost innocent. You'd never guess that this woman could weaponize absence like a blade. I wanted to wake her, to ask her if this was what she wanted, a marriage that had become a cold agreement. But I didn't. I just lay there, feeling the distance grow, inch by inch. The next morning, she left for work early, without a word. No kiss goodbye, no look over her shoulder. The front door closed softly and the house exhaled with her absence. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the indentation she left behind on the mattress. That hollow space was a perfect metaphor for us. Something once warm, now cold, shaped by what used to be there. Later that week, something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single argument, no breaking of plates, no harsh words. It was quieter, like a thread snapping somewhere deep in the back of my mind. I was at work, in a meeting, when I realized I hadn't thought about her all day. Not once. Not even when I'd seen something funny she would have liked years ago. I didn't feel guilt or longing, just nothing. That nothingness startled me. It felt like a betrayal, but not of her, of myself. Because for so long, she'd occupied every corner of my thoughts, even when she didn't deserve to. And now that she was fading, I didn't know what to do with the space she left behind. A few nights later, she decided to talk, or at least pretend to. We were in the living room. The TV was on, muted. She turned to me and said, "You've been distant lately." The irony almost made me laugh. "Have I?" I asked, my tone sharper than I meant. "Yes," she said, frowning slightly. "You barely talk anymore. You come home late, and when you're here, you barely look at me." I stared at her for a moment, trying to understand if she truly didn't see it. The years of emotional starvation, the endless waiting for scraps of affection. "Claire," I said finally, "you stopped talking to me months ago. I just stopped trying to fill the silence." She sighed, that same practiced sigh that always meant she was done with the conversation. "You're being dramatic. I just needed space." 3 months of space, I said, not raising my voice, just stating it plainly. "That's not space, Claire, that's punishment." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Punishment, really? You think everything is about you?" That was her favorite defense. Deflection. Turn my pain into ego, my hurt into accusation. I didn't respond. I'd learned there was no point. Talking to her was like throwing stones into a well. You never heard them hit the bottom. She stood, grabbed her glass of wine, and left the room. "You're impossible," she said as she climbed the stairs. And just like that, another evening dissolved into silence. But that night, as I lay awake again, something inside me hardened. I wasn't angry. I was done. I'd finally reached the edge of caring, the thin line where love runs out of fuel and all that's left is survival. The next morning, I didn't make breakfast for both of us. I made coffee for one. I didn't ask about her plans or wish her a good day. I moved around her like she had done to me for months, calm, detached, polite. She noticed, though she didn't admit it. The strange thing about people who use control as affection is that they panic when it stops working. A week of my quiet, and her indifference began to crack. I caught her watching me once, her expression unreadable. When I asked if something was wrong, she said, "No, just tired." That word, tired, had become her shield. By the end of that month, I'd stopped sleeping in our bed. I told her it was because of back pain, which wasn't entirely untrue. I slept in the guest room, the smallest room in the house, but somehow it felt larger than anywhere else. I could breathe in there. I could think. I'd lie awake reading, or sometimes just staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange, calm emptiness that had replaced the chaos. One night she stood by the door, watching me. "You're really sleeping in here?" she asked, voice low, uncertain. "For now," I said. She nodded slowly, like she didn't believe me, but didn't know what else to say. She lingered for a moment before turning away. That hesitation, that flicker of confusion, told me she was beginning to lose her grip on the power she thought she had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not freedom yet, but relief. The kind that comes when you realize you finally stopped fighting a battle that was never winnable. I understood then that love shouldn't be measured by how much pain you can endure. It should be measured by the peace you feel in its presence. And peace, in our home, had become a foreign language. That realization wasn't explosive. It was quiet, steady, undeniable, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. I didn't know what would come next, whether I'd leave or stay, whether she'd even care either way. But I knew this much: I couldn't go back to being invisible. Something had shifted permanently. The man who once begged for affection had stopped asking. And in that silence, the same silence she'd once used to punish me, I found the beginning of my strength. That was the real turning point. Not a confrontation, not an argument, but a quiet moment in which I finally realized she couldn't control what she no longer owned. By the 4th month, the house no longer felt like a home. It was a collection of walls containing 2 people who shared nothing but bills and oxygen. The rhythm of our lives had become mechanical, doors opening and closing, footsteps crossing hallways, words exchanged only out of necessity. But under that surface of civility, something deeper had shifted. I had stopped trying. It's strange how liberation often begins in stillness. For so long, I thought detachment was a form of defeat, that if I stopped reaching out, I'd be admitting failure. But what I discovered instead was that silence, when chosen, becomes strength. When you no longer chase validation, you start to see clearly. I began observing her as though she were a stranger I'd accidentally moved in with. I noticed how she hummed softly while getting ready for work, but never when I was in the room. How she spent long minutes texting in the hallway, her back turned just enough to make sure I couldn't see the screen. I noticed the perfume she started wearing, one I didn't recognize, one I hadn't bought her. Small changes, subtle but deliberate. I could have confronted her, demanded answers, but I didn't. Not out of fear, out of exhaustion. The truth, whatever it was, didn't even matter anymore. I started reclaiming pieces of my life that I'd abandoned trying to please her. I ran before sunrise, long runs through quiet Denver streets where the air smelled like pine and asphalt and cold earth. For 30, 40 minutes it was just me. No expectations, no criticism. The rhythm of my feet against the pavement felt like proof that I still existed. I'd come home sweaty and alive, and she'd barely glance at me as I passed. One morning as I poured coffee, she asked, "Since when do you run?" I looked up. Since I needed to breathe again. She blinked, caught off guard by my tone, but said nothing. It was the first honest sentence I'd spoken to her in weeks. At work, I started staying late again, not to avoid her this time, but because I'd rediscovered a strange calm in solitude. My colleagues began noticing I was different, more focused, sharper, even more confident. It wasn't happiness exactly, but something cleaner, the absence of tension. At home, Claire seemed unsettled by my calmness. It was as though my indifference had disrupted the pattern of control she'd built around me. One evening, she stopped me in the hallway. "Are you angry at me or something?" she asked, her tone flat but probing. I met her eyes and said, "No, I just stopped being affected." She frowned. "Affected by what?" "By you." For a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe even fear, but she masked it quickly. "You're being dramatic again," she said, brushing past me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't oppressive anymore. It was mine now. I began to remember things I'd forgotten I loved. Music, cooking, sketching. I'd sit in the living room on weekends, headphones in, drawing on my old sketch pad. She'd watch from the corner of her eye sometimes, pretending not to, pretending she didn't care. But I noticed her confusion. The more I rebuilt myself, the more she seemed to unravel. One Saturday afternoon, I was cleaning out the garage when she came down holding her phone. "Do you want to go out for dinner tonight?" she asked suddenly. The question stunned me. It had been months since she'd made any attempt to do something together. I turned toward her, suspicious but composed. "Why now?" She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Because we should. It's been a while." I nodded slowly. "All right." We went to a small Italian place we used to love years ago. The kind of place where the lights are low and the servers greet you by name. We sat across from each other, 2 ghosts revisiting a scene from a past life. She talked about work, her co-workers, her schedule. I listened politely, but said little. At one point she reached for her wine and said, almost casually, "You've changed lately. You seem distant." "I am," I replied. She tilted her head. "You don't even try anymore." I let out a quiet laugh. Claire, for years I was the only one trying. Her eyes narrowed. You're rewriting things now? No, I said calmly. I'm just remembering them accurately. For the rest of the meal, she barely spoke. I didn't fill the silence. It was refreshing, actually, not having to chase words, not having to perform the illusion of connection. On the drive home, she turned to me suddenly. Do you even love me anymore? Her voice cracked slightly like she wasn't ready to hear the answer. I kept my eyes on the road. I did, deeply. But love doesn't survive one person's absence forever. She didn't reply. I could feel her eyes on me, searching for the man who used to plead, used to apologize, used to beg for scraps of affection. That man wasn't there anymore. That night, she came into my room, the guest room, which had unofficially become mine, and stood in the doorway. You're sleeping here again? Yes, I said simply. She hesitated. This isn't what I wanted. I looked up from my book. Then why did you build it this way? Her mouth opened, then closed again. No answer. She turned and left quietly. After she was gone, I sat there for a while staring at the page I hadn't turned in 10 minutes. I felt something strange. Not vindication, not triumph, but a kind of profound relief. I had finally reached the point where her confusion no longer hurt me. It only confirmed what I already knew. I had taken back my power. A few days later, I got home early and found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through old photos on her phone. She looked up at me and asked, Do you ever think about how we used to be? All the time, I said. That's how I know I can't go back. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes full of something unspoken. Then she turned away and nodded, as if silently admitting defeat. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because anything had been resolved, but because I'd accepted that some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some wounds aren't meant to heal together. I woke up before sunrise and went running again. The air was cold, crisp, the streets empty except for me and the sound of my shoes on the pavement. As I turned the corner onto a quiet street lined with trees, I felt something inside me loosen, the last thread of guilt, of obligation. For so long, I thought freedom meant leaving. But that morning I understood it begins long before you walk out the door. It begins the moment you stop being afraid to be alone. When I came home, Claire was in the kitchen. She looked at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I poured myself coffee, nodded, and went upstairs. That's when I realized she had nothing left to withhold, nothing left to deny, because the one thing she had used to control me, affection, intimacy, connection, had already lost its power. I had stopped needing what she refused to give, and that, more than any argument or ultimatum, was the beginning of my escape. There's a moment in every failing marriage when you stop waiting for the other person to notice your pain. Mine came on a Thursday morning, when I realized I'd spent half a year apologizing for things I didn't do just to keep the peace. I was standing in the kitchen staring at a half-empty coffee pot when it hit me. I had become someone who existed only to avoid confrontation. That was the morning I decided I wouldn't say sorry anymore. Not for breathing, not for existing, not for wanting to be loved. Claire walked in wearing a silk blouse I hadn't seen before, her hair tied up neatly, her perfume sharp and deliberate. She moved around me as if I were part of the furniture, something that filled space but didn't matter. Morning, I said, my voice even. She glanced at me briefly, then at her phone. Yeah, that was it. One syllable. No warmth, no recognition, nothing. Are you going out after work? I asked, trying to sound casual. Her fingers paused mid-scroll. Why do you ask? I was just wondering if I should make dinner. She shrugged, her tone clipped. Don't bother. I'll eat out. That was her favorite phrase lately. I'll eat out. It meant she had plans that didn't include me. I didn't press further. I'd stopped trying to decode her excuses. When she left, I sat at the table for a long time, the sound of the door closing echoing in my chest. It wasn't heartbreak anymore, it was resignation. I realized I'd become the ghost of my own home, invisible, tolerated, and quietly erased. I drove to work, but barely remembered the route. My mind was somewhere else, stuck between what used to be and what I knew was already gone. My co-worker, James, noticed I was off. "You look like a guy running on fumes," he said as we passed each other in the hallway. "I probably am," I admitted. He patted my shoulder. "Sometimes the only way to survive is to stop trying to fix what doesn't want to be fixed." His words lingered with me all day. When I got home that evening, the house was dark except for a faint light in the living room. Claire was on the couch, her laptop open, a glass of wine half empty beside her. I didn't expect her to look up, and she didn't disappoint. I stood there studying her, realizing how much she'd changed, and how little of the woman I'd married was left in her. But what hurt more was how much I had changed because of her. The way I walked quieter, the way I measured every word, the way I carried guilt that didn't belong to me. "Claire," I said, my voice calm, deliberate. She sighed without looking up. "What?" "I'm done apologizing for everything." Her hands froze on the keyboard. She finally looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer. "For months, every time something went wrong, I said sorry, even when I didn't do anything. I apologized for wanting to talk, for asking to spend time with you, for wanting to feel loved. I'm not doing that anymore." She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "You're overreacting," she said, rolling her eyes. That word again, overreacting. The weapon she used to shrink every one of my feelings until I doubted my own reality. "No," I said firmly. "I'm reacting appropriately to being ignored." Her lips tightened. "You're making me the bad guy again." "I'm not making you anything. I'm just done letting you treat me like a mistake you regret." She closed her laptop, her voice sharpening. "You always turn everything into drama. I just needed space." "Space," I repeated quietly. "You've had an entire galaxy of it, Claire." "Me?" She stood up then, brushing past me. "I can't talk to you when you're like this." That sentence, one she'd used countless times, no longer stung. It just confirmed what I already knew. There was no talking left between us, only avoidance. That night, I didn't chase her upstairs. I didn't stand by the door waiting for a sign of remorse. I went into the guest room, closed the door, and sat there in the dark for a long time. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. I was simply empty, the kind of emptiness that comes after you've given everything and realized it made no difference. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. The guilt began to fade. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped waiting for her approval. I moved differently, lighter, freer. I started cooking for one, reading late into the night, leaving the house without telling her where I was going. She noticed. At first, she ignored it, pretending my detachment didn't bother her. But then the confusion began to show. One Saturday morning, I was getting ready to go hiking, something I hadn't done in years. She appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Where are you going?" "Out," I said simply. "With who?" "Just me." She frowned. "You don't even tell me your plans anymore." I turned toward her, met her eyes, and said, "You made it clear my presence doesn't matter, so I assumed my absence wouldn't either." Her jaw tightened. She didn't respond. That day, I drove out to the Rockies alone. I hiked for hours under a wide blue sky, the air cool and clean, the silence vast, but not heavy. For the first time in months, I felt peace, a raw, unfiltered peace that had nothing to do with anyone else. I realized how small my life had become inside that house, how much I'd allowed myself to be reduced to someone waiting for permission to exist. When I came back that evening, she was sitting at the table, clearly waiting. "You didn't answer my texts," she said. "I didn't see a reason to," I replied, hanging up my jacket. She glared. "I was worried." I almost laughed. "No, you were curious. There's a difference." Her face flushed with irritation. "You're being cruel." "No," I said softly. "I'm finally being honest." She pushed back her chair and stormed out, slamming the bedroom door. But for once, the sound didn't hurt. It sounded like punctuation, the end of something that had dragged on too long. That night I slept deeply, dreamlessly. When I woke the next morning, the sun was pouring through the blinds, and I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, not the fragile, temporary kind that depends on someone else's mood, real calm. The kind that comes from knowing you've stopped betraying yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. As I made coffee, I thought about how much of my life had revolved around trying to make her happy. Every word, every gesture, every compromise had been a bid for affection she had no intention of giving. And now, standing there in the quiet kitchen, I finally accepted that love shouldn't be earned like forgiveness. It should be given, or it isn't love at all. Later that day, she tried to act normal. Small talk, polite questions, the occasional forced smile, but I could see it in her eyes. She'd lost her grip. The dynamic had shifted, and she didn't know how to function without the power that came from my constant guilt. I didn't revel in that. I wasn't seeking revenge. I just knew I was done. That night, as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset stain the sky in streaks of gold and red, I realized something important. Forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt you. It's for the part of yourself that stayed too long, believing things would change. I forgave myself for staying, for begging, for shrinking. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I knew this much. The man who had once apologized just to be seen was gone, and in his place stood someone new, someone who had finally learned that silence can be dignity, and walking away can be the loudest form of love you'll ever give yourself. There's something peculiar about living in the same house as someone who's emotionally gone. The walls remember the laughter you've forgotten, and every room starts to echo with what used to be. By the time winter rolled around, our house in Colorado felt like a museum of former affection, well decorated, meticulously arranged, and completely lifeless. Claire and I still functioned as a couple on paper. We paid the bills, went to work, attended family dinners pretending everything was fine. But the truth was, she had turned into a distant silhouette moving through my life, visible but unreachable. The silence between us had become its own language, cold and deliberate. That morning started like most others. I made coffee for one, even though there were 2 cups sitting on the counter. She came downstairs, scrolling through her phone, wearing that same detachment like perfume. "Morning," I said, just to test if my voice still meant anything. "Morning," she replied absently, not lifting her eyes. It was strange how even the simplest words had lost weight. I remembered when a morning between us used to come with a kiss, a smile, a brief touch. Now it was just protocol. She left early that day, and when the door closed, I sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from me. That's when it hit me. She was physically there, but emotionally, she'd moved out months ago. The woman I'd married was still in my house, but her affection wasn't. The realization didn't come with tears. It came with a dull clarity, like finally seeing the outline of something you'd refused to acknowledge. I didn't hate her. I didn't even resent her anymore. What I felt was something quieter, an acceptance of the fact that I had been grieving a living person. Work that day felt mechanical. I went through the motions, nodding at colleagues, pretending to care about numbers and reports. But inside, my mind was elsewhere, tracing back to where it all began to fade. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment love had turned into tolerance. Was it the first time she refused to touch me? The first time I stopped asking? Or had it been a slow erosion, so gradual neither of us noticed until there was nothing left? That night I came home later than usual. The lights were off, the house cold. On the kitchen table sat a note. "Stayed at Laura's tonight. Don't wait up." No explanation, no apology, just another declaration of absence. I stared at the paper for a long time, realizing how a simple sentence could cut deeper than any argument. Instead of anger, I felt calm, almost eerie calm. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch and turned on the television, not really watching. My mind drifted. I thought about the early days, when we'd stay up talking about everything and nothing, when she'd fall asleep with her head on my chest, when our laughter filled every corner of the house. I tried to remember the sound of her genuine laugh and couldn't. It scared me, realizing how memories fade even when you fight to keep them alive. The next morning, I decided I wouldn't bring it up. I wouldn't ask where she went or why. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood she wanted me to chase. Her distance wasn't confusion. It was control. Every unanswered question, every cold response was her way of reminding me she had the power to decide when and if I mattered. So I took that power back, quietly, deliberately. I started making plans without her. Dinner with coworkers, weekends hiking, even a trip to visit my brother in Seattle. I didn't announce it. I just went. When she realized, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" I looked at her and said, "Because you didn't tell me when you stopped coming home." Her expression shifted, a brief flicker of something like guilt, then annoyance. "You're being melodramatic." "No," I said softly, "just honest." That honesty unsettled her. She wasn't used to it. For years I had been predictable, patient, forgiving, desperate to fix what she kept breaking. Now my calm unnerved her more than my anger ever could. One evening, she came home earlier than expected. I was on the porch, reading with a cup of tea. She stood by the door, hesitant. "You're out here a lot lately," she said. "It's quiet," I replied. "You never used to like sitting outside." "I never used to need peace this badly." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're making everything sound worse than it is." "Claire," I said gently, "you've been gone for months. You just forgot to leave." She didn't answer. She turned and went inside. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed in the guest room, I heard her moving around upstairs. Doors opening, drawers sliding, the faint rustle of a suitcase zipper. I didn't ask. I didn't stop her. If she wanted to go, she was free to. If she wanted to stay, I wasn't going to beg her to. The next morning she was still there. The suitcase was gone. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her eyes red-rimmed. "You didn't ask where I was last night," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "You told me you didn't owe me explanations. I decided to believe you." Her voice cracked slightly. "You really don't care anymore, do you?" I shook my head. "I cared more than I should have for far too long. Now I'm just done pretending that's love." She didn't respond. The silence stretched, heavy but clear. After she left for work, I sat there for a long time, thinking about how love can turn into absence without either person realizing it's happening. You think silence means safety. That distance is just a phase, until it becomes your reality. That weekend, I started clearing things out. Old photos, souvenirs from trips, the anniversary cards we'd stopped writing. I didn't throw them away. Not yet. I just boxed them up. The act felt like closing a chapter, quietly, without bitterness. For years, I believed that endurance was proof of love, that if I stayed patient long enough, if I kept forgiving, something would shift. But it doesn't work that way. Love doesn't thrive in one person's persistence. It withers under one person's neglect. That night I cooked dinner for myself, poured a glass of wine, and sat alone at the table. It didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I had been through the storm of wanting to be seen, and came out on the other side. Tired, maybe, but intact. When Claire came home, she stopped in the doorway, surprised to see me calm, content. "You didn't wait for me," she said. I smiled faintly. "You haven't waited for me in months." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in a long time, she had no words. That silence, the same silence that used to break me, now felt like victory, because she could only control me as long as I needed her acknowledgement. And the day I stopped needing it was the day her absence stopped hurting. That was the turning point I didn't expect, not the moment she left, but the moment I realized I was already free, even while she still lived under my roof. And that freedom, quiet and undeniable, was the first real thing I'd felt in a very long time. It was late February when I started noticing something strange about Claire. The woman who had once mastered the art of indifference began to seem unsettled. Her detachment, once deliberate and polished, was cracking around the edges. She had spent months treating me like I was invisible, assuming my silence meant submission. But when I stopped reacting altogether, when I became truly untouchable, something in her changed. I could see it in the way she lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary when I was there, the way her eyes followed me when I walked past, though she pretended not to notice. Even the way she spoke had shifted, not soft, not affectionate, but edged with uncertainty. It wasn't love that resurfaced, it was control slipping through her hands. That evening I came home from work to find her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a forced calm. The television was on, muted. A glass of wine, half empty, rested on the table beside her. "Hey," I said as I passed through. "Hey," she replied, her tone flat, but I heard the hesitation in it. I went upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, and started packing a small duffel bag. I didn't plan to leave permanently, not yet. I just needed air, real air, far from the suffocating silence of that house. When I came back downstairs, she was standing by the counter, arms crossed. "Where are you going?" "Out of town for the weekend," I said. "Since when?" "Since this morning." Her eyebrows drew together. "You didn't tell me." I met her eyes. "You didn't ask." There it was, the first flash of real irritation I'd seen from her in weeks. She wasn't angry because I was leaving, she was angry because she hadn't been informed. Control, not concern. "I think it's rude not to tell your wife when you're leaving town," she said, voice rising slightly. "And I think it's rude to treat your husband like a stranger in his own home," I replied evenly. "But we've both adjusted to some rudeness lately." She stared at me for a long time, her jaw tightening. Then she turned away, muttering, "Do whatever you want." That used to be her final word, the sentence that would leave me feeling guilty, desperate to fix what wasn't broken by me. But this time, I just nodded, grabbed my bag, and walked out. I drove until the lights of Denver disappeared in the rearview mirror. I found a small cabin 2 hours west, near Estes Park. It wasn't fancy, just a quiet place surrounded by trees, snow gathering on the porch, and silence that felt clean rather than oppressive. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling watched or weighed down. I made a fire, poured myself a drink, and sat by the window watching the snow fall. The world felt huge again, and I realized how small she had made mine. That night, I slept deeply. No tension, no dreams of confrontation, just rest. The next morning, my phone had 6 missed calls and 2 text messages. The first read, "Where are you?" The second came an hour later. "So you're just disappearing now?" I didn't answer. By the afternoon, there were 12 missed calls, then 17. The messages grew less casual, shorter, sharper. "You're being childish. This isn't how adults handle things. Are you with someone?" I smiled bitterly at that last one. The irony was almost poetic. She'd spent months rejecting me, withholding every ounce of warmth, and now the thought of me giving my attention elsewhere suddenly terrified her. I didn't respond. I spent that evening reading by the fire, enjoying the quiet hum of my own company. There was a certain freedom in not being reachable, in knowing she couldn't dictate my next move. By Sunday, she called again, and this time she left a voicemail. Her voice trembled slightly, the confidence gone. "Mark, I don't know what you're trying to prove, but can you at least tell me you're okay? I can't just sit here wondering where you are." That pause before the last sentence, that was the first real emotion I'd heard from her in months. But it didn't move me like it once would have, because I knew what it was. Not love, not remorse, but fear. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing control. When I returned home late Sunday night, she was waiting. The house smelled faintly of lavender, her attempt to create an atmosphere of calm. She was sitting on the couch again, but this time she looked different, restless, anxious. "You didn't answer my calls," she said, standing as I walked in. I didn't have much to say. "Do you realize how inconsiderate that was?" I set my bag down. "Do you realize how it feels to be ignored for months and then suddenly scolded for silence?" She froze. I watched the realization flicker across her face, that she couldn't play both roles at once. She couldn't reject me and demand my devotion in the same breath. "You're acting different," she said quietly. "I am different," I answered. I just stopped living like a shadow in my own life. She exhaled shakily, sitting back down. I don't like this version of you. I know, I said softly, because this version doesn't revolve around you anymore. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, yes, but more revealing than anything either of us could have said. She was confronting, perhaps for the first time, the reality that her power over me had never been real. It existed only as long as I allowed it. Later that night, she knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice small. I opened it halfway. "About what?" She hesitated. "About us. I don't like how things have been. I feel like you're slipping away." I leaned against the frame, studying her face. "Claire, I didn't slip away. You pushed me away. I just stopped clinging to the door." Her eyes watered, not a full cry, but close. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," I interrupted gently. "You meant every silence, every cold shoulder, every rejection. You just didn't expect me to stop needing you." She stared at me for a long time, then whispered, "So what now?" "Now," I said, "we either learn to respect each other, or we stop pretending this is marriage." She didn't answer. She turned and walked down the hall, leaving my question hanging in the air like smoke. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how love dies, not suddenly, but in small moments of disregard that pile up until you can't remember why you ever begged to be seen. I realized then that I no longer needed her acknowledgement, her explanations, or even her remorse. The next morning, she made breakfast for both of us, for the first time in months. It was a strange attempt at normalcy. She set a plate down in front of me and said, "I thought you might be hungry." I thanked her, but the gesture didn't change anything. It wasn't affection. It was fear disguised as effort. And as I ate in silence, I understood something crucial. She didn't want me back because she loved me. She wanted me back because she no longer recognized herself without the version of me she controlled. That morning, as I drove to work, a weight lifted off me completely. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was finally indifferent, not out of numbness, but peace. Because once you realize someone fears losing their power more than losing your heart, you stop giving them either. And for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel invisible. I felt untouchable. The first apology came in the form of breakfast, eggs, toast, and bacon, arranged neatly on a plate I hadn't seen used in months. The kitchen smelled like olive oil and nostalgia. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, unsure if I should step in or turn around. Claire was at the stove, her hair tied loosely, pretending not to notice my hesitation. "I made enough for both of us," she said, her tone rehearsed. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said quickly, "but I wanted to." That was new. Wanted to. A phrase that used to carry meaning, but now felt foreign between us. I sat down, mostly out of politeness, and watched her slide eggs onto my plate. There was an awkward silence, the kind that used to be filled with morning chatter, but now it pressed on us like fog. "How was your night?" she asked, breaking the quiet. "Peaceful," I said simply. Her hand froze mid-reach for the salt. "Peaceful?" "Yes." She swallowed, nodded, and looked down. "That's good." It should have felt nice. Her trying, the small gestures, the careful tone. But it didn't. It felt like someone trying to glue together the shards of a vase they'd smashed, only to realize the cracks still showed. After breakfast, she followed me to the door. "Are you still mad at me?" she asked softly. I turned to her. "I'm not mad, Claire. I just don't feel anything anymore." Her eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said carefully, "I used to wake up wondering what I did wrong. Now I wake up and realize it doesn't matter." She didn't know what to do with that. It's strange how power dynamics shift when one person stops playing. For months, she had been the one setting the terms, deciding when we talked, when we touched, when we pretended everything was fine. But now that I'd withdrawn, she was the one off balance. That evening, she came into my study, holding a cup of tea. "I've been thinking," she began cautiously, "maybe we should talk about us." I put my pen down. "All right. I know I've been distant," she said. "I've been going through things." I don't expect you to understand, but it wasn't about you. That's the thing, I replied. It's never about me. It's about you, your moods, your silences, your distance. I've been orbiting around your emotions like some satellite waiting for a signal that never comes. She looked down, embarrassed. I didn't realize how bad it got. You did, I said quietly. You just didn't care until you realized I could leave. Her shoulders tensed. That's not fair. It's the truth. For the first time, she didn't argue. She just stood there, silent, as if trying to find the version of me she used to manipulate, the one who'd rush in to comfort her guilt before it settled. But that man was gone. Days passed. She started trying harder. She texted me during work hours, little things like, "How's your day?" or "Dinner tonight," gestures that would have meant something once. Now they felt like lines from a script she barely believed in. One evening, she came home with takeout from my favorite restaurant. "Thought we could eat together," she said, forcing a smile. I nodded, sat down, and thanked her. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "I miss us, Mark." I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond either. "You don't believe me, do you?" she asked. "I believe you miss how I made you feel," I said. "Not me, just the version of you that existed when I was chasing your attention." Her eyes glistened, but I didn't flinch. I'd cried all my tears months ago. Now all I had left was clarity. Later that night, she knocked on my door again. "Can I come in?" "Sure." She sat on the edge of the bed, fidgeting with her hands. "I know I hurt you," she said quietly. "I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I thought you'd never stop loving me no matter how far I pushed." "That's exactly what you thought," I said. "And for a long time, you were right." She nodded, looking down. "You used to look at me like I was the only person in the world. I miss that." I studied her for a long moment. "You stopped earning it." Her head lifted sharply. "That's cruel." "No," I said softly. "It's honest." She started to cry then. Soft, quiet tears, the kind that used to break me. But they didn't anymore. I'd learned that remorse often arrives only when consequences do. And sometimes the regret isn't for the loss itself, but for losing the power that came with it. The next few days, she was different. Not performatively kind, but genuinely subdued. She started cleaning the house again, cooking dinners, sitting near me in silence as if her presence alone could rebuild what she had burned. But the more she tried, the clearer it became. Her timing was wrong. Love doesn't wait forever. One night, she stood at the doorway as I was reading. "Can we start over?" she asked. I looked up. "Start over?" "Yes. I know I've been awful. I took you for granted. I thought you'd always be there, and I was wrong. I see it now." Her voice cracked mid-sentence, but I stayed quiet. "I just want another chance," she whispered, "to make it right." The old me would have jumped at that, would have felt relief just hearing her admit it. But now all I felt was exhaustion. "Claire," I said gently, "I don't hate you. I just can't go back. You made home feel like punishment. You turned affection into a privilege I had to earn. I can't unlearn that." She shook her head. "People make mistakes." "They do," I said, "and some of them learn from it. Others repeat it until the person they hurt finally leaves." Her tears fell harder, her words breaking between sobs. "Please, Mark, I'll change." But it was too late. Change means nothing when it's born from desperation. You can't rebuild love on the ruins of indifference. I stood, took a breath, and said quietly, "You don't need to beg. I'm not angry. I just don't feel connected to you anymore." She stared at me, stunned, as if I had spoken in a language she didn't understand. Maybe because for the first time, I wasn't arguing or defending. I was simply finished. That night, she didn't come to bed. I heard her crying in the next room, muffled but raw. I didn't move. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, realizing how peace can sound cruel to someone who's only ever known control. In the morning, I made coffee. She was at the table, eyes red but posture stiff, pride holding her together. "You're really done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied, "but I wish you well." She nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "I thought you'd fight for me." I did, I said. You just didn't notice when it mattered. As I left for work that morning, she stood by the window watching me go. I didn't look back, not out of spite, but because looking back is what kept me stuck for so long. Love, I realized, doesn't die with anger. It dies with indifference. And that morning, as the sun rose over the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I knew something irreversible had happened, not between us, but inside me. I wasn't waiting for her to change anymore. I wasn't clinging to hope or replaying what went wrong. For the first time in years, I was free. Not from her, but from the version of myself that needed her validation to feel whole. And that freedom, quiet and final, was worth every moment of pain that came before it. It had been weeks since Claire's tears that night, but the house remained wrapped in an unfamiliar kind of quiet. Not the hostile silence of resentment, but the stillness that follows surrender. She no longer lashed out or avoided me. Instead, she moved carefully, almost timidly, as if afraid that one wrong word would shatter the thin glass of civility we'd built. And yet, that silence gave me everything I needed. It was my answer, not in words, but in what those words had lost the power to fix. Most mornings I woke before sunrise. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, watching light crawl across the floorboards. I used to dread mornings. The quiet felt suffocating then, a reminder that love had left the house. Now, it felt like a kind of liberation. Claire would come downstairs an hour later, her hair neatly brushed, her tone always polite, careful. "Morning," she'd say. "Morning." That was all. No tension, no warmth, no expectation. Just two people sharing air, performing the last routines of a marriage that had already ended in spirit. But beneath her calm, I could sense something else. Fear. Not the loud kind, but the kind that lives in the eyes, where regret hides when it's too late to speak. She had realized, I think, that she couldn't reach me anymore. One Friday evening, she came into the living room while I was reading. She hovered near the doorway, hesitant. "Do you want to watch something together?" she asked. I looked up, surprised. It was the first time in months she'd suggested something that wasn't practical or obligatory. "Sure," I said. She sat at the other end of the couch, leaving a cautious space between us. She scrolled through the streaming service, stopping on a movie we used to watch years ago, one of those old romantic dramas where people say all the things real couples forget to. Halfway through, she shifted closer. The gesture was small, but I felt it. The first deliberate attempt at proximity in a long time. I didn't move away, but I didn't respond either. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I'd finally learned the difference between longing and weakness. When the movie ended, she stayed seated, staring at the credits. "I miss how we used to be," she said quietly. "So do I," I replied, setting down my glass. "But missing something doesn't bring it back," her voice faltered. "Can't we at least try?" "Try what?" I asked. "Pretend it never happened? Pretend months of rejection just vanish because you decided you're ready again?" Her eyes shimmered, but I didn't soften. "I made mistakes," she said. "Claire, they weren't mistakes," I said gently. "Mistakes are things you regret in the moment. You made choices, deliberate ones. You treated affection like it was a favor, and when I stopped begging for it, you called it cruelty." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, her face pale under the lamplight. "You've changed." "Yes," I said. "I had to." That night, she didn't follow me upstairs. I heard her pacing the hallway for a while, then the faint sound of her door closing. Over the following days, something strange happened. She started trying to bring life back into the house, music in the kitchen, flowers on the table, a sudden interest in the things I used to enjoy. But none of it felt natural. It was all effort without sincerity, gestures without understanding. She wasn't rebuilding. She was reacting. I began spending more time outside. Long drives, quiet walks by the river, lunches alone at a cafe downtown. The barista there, a young woman named Allison, started recognizing me. She had a warm, unguarded way of speaking, the kind of tone I hadn't heard in years. She didn't flirt. She simply treated me like a person worth talking to. It's strange how small kindnesses can remind you how deprived you've been. One afternoon as I left the cafe, my phone buzzed. Claire, are you coming home soon? I stared at the message for a moment before replying, eventually. When I arrived home, she was waiting in the kitchen again. You're spending a lot of time out lately, she said. I needed space. From me, from the version of me I was around you, I said. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. She looked down, nodding faintly. I deserve that. There was no satisfaction in her admission, just sadness, hers and mine, tangled together in a silence too deep for repair. The next evening, I found her sitting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug. She didn't look up when I joined her. I don't know how we got here, she said. We stopped listening, I said. You stopped needing me and I stopped being myself trying to keep you. She sighed. Do you still love me? It was a question I'd been avoiding for months. Once, I would have answered instinctively. Now I hesitated. I think I love the memory of what we were, I said finally, not what we are. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them. I don't know how to fix it. You can't, I said softly. Not everything broken can be rebuilt. We sat in silence after that, watching the sky dim into twilight. The sound of distant traffic filled the air, faint but steady, life carrying on, indifferent to the ruins of ours. That night, I dreamed of the early days again, of laughter, late-night drives, her head on my shoulder. But even in the dream, something was off. Her face kept fading in and out, replaced by emptiness. When I woke, I realized it wasn't just her I'd lost. I'd lost the version of myself that believed love alone could save something dying. The following weekend, I packed a small suitcase, not because of anger, but clarity. I needed time to exist outside the shadow of what we'd become. When she saw me carrying the bag, her expression froze. Are you leaving? For a while. Where? Does it matter? Her lips trembled. So that's it? No, I said quietly. This is me giving both of us the chance to be honest. You don't want this marriage. You want control of it. There's a difference. She shook her head. You're twisting everything. I'm just calling it what it is. Her eyes filled again, and this time I looked away. I didn't want to remember her like that, crying only when she realized her silence no longer held me captive. Before I left, she said, if you go, I don't know if I can forgive you. I paused at the door. Claire, I forgave you a long time ago. That's why I can leave without hating you. The drive was quiet, the city lights fading behind me as the road opened wide and dark. I rolled down the window, feeling the cold air rush in, sharp, bracing, alive. For the first time, I wasn't running from her or chasing peace. I was simply moving toward it. That night, in a small motel 2 towns away, I sat by the window, looking out at the neon glow of the highway. I didn't feel lonely. I felt empty in the right way, cleared out, like space waiting for something real to fill it. And as I watched the traffic roll by, I realized what that long silence between us had truly meant. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't cruelty, it was truth. The sound of something ending that had already ended long before either of us said it out loud. Silence, I thought, doesn't always mean indifference. Sometimes it's the only honest language left between two people who've said too much and meant too little. That night, I didn't text her. I didn't wonder if she'd call. I let the silence stretch, finally comfortable inside it, because for the first time it belonged to me. The first call came 2 days after I left. I saw her name flash across the screen just as I was checking into a small roadside inn outside Boulder. For a moment, my instinct almost made me answer, the old reflex of trying to ease her worry, to fix what was already shattered. But I didn't. I let it ring until the screen went dark. She called again an hour later. Then 3 more times that night, I turned off my phone. I didn't block her. I didn't need to. Silence was my response now, not anger. The next morning, I woke to a dozen missed calls and 4 messages. Please call me back. I just want to talk. Where are you? You can't just disappear like this. For years, she had vanished emotionally, retreating into silence whenever it suited her. Now she was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of that void, when every unanswered call becomes an echo of your own neglect. I spent that morning walking through town. The sky was pale blue, the air cold enough to sting. I stopped by a diner for breakfast and watched families talk, couples laugh, people living simple lives. It was strangely humbling, realizing how much of my time had been consumed by one person's moods, one person's walls, while life kept moving all around me. Around noon, I turned my phone back on. Another 8 missed calls, 2 voicemails. I didn't listen to them right away. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, just staring at the device buzzing faintly in my hand. This small, glowing object that had once been a lifeline between us, now just another chain she wanted to pull. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I played the first voicemail. Her voice trembled. "Mark, I don't know where you are, but please call me. I can't sleep. I can't think. I know I hurt you, but I need to fix this. Just tell me what to do." The second one came a few hours later, calmer but colder. "If you think running away makes you the bigger person, fine. But don't pretend this is how adults handle problems. You're acting like a stranger." I deleted them both. Not out of cruelty, but peace. I'd already lived that cycle. Guilt, apology, distance, repeat. This time I didn't want to replay it. That night, I sat outside under a sky littered with stars, the cold air biting at my skin. I thought about all the nights I'd spent waiting for her to talk, to care, to see me. And here I was, finally unreachable, finally free from her orbit, and she was the one waiting. The irony wasn't satisfying, it was just quiet. On the third day, she texted again, "You don't get to just walk away from 12 years of marriage." I stared at the words. 12 years. So much time, so many memories reduced to a sentence built on ownership you don't get to. That was the problem in a nutshell. To her, marriage was possession, not partnership. My love had been a resource, not a choice. That night, she called again. I answered this time, not out of weakness, but because I needed to hear what she had to say. She didn't speak right away. I could hear her breathing. "Mark, I'm here," I said. "Oh, thank God." Her voice cracked. "Where are you?" "I'm safe," I replied. "That's all that matters. You can't just vanish like this," she said. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me?" I almost laughed. "What I'm doing to you?" "I was worried," she said quickly, defensively. "You didn't tell me you were leaving." "Claire," I said quietly, "for months, you didn't tell me where you were going, when you'd be home, what you were thinking. You made every silence feel like punishment. Now that I've done the same, suddenly you care? That's not fair." "It's not," I said. "You withdrew everything. Affection, warmth, words. You starved me of connection and called it space. And now that I've given you what you gave me, it's unbearable, isn't it?" She was silent. I could hear her trying to steady her breathing. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Yes, you did," I said, not unkindly. "You just didn't think I'd ever stop forgiving you." There was a long pause. "I don't want this to be over." "It's been over," I said. "You just stopped paying attention." Her voice broke. "Can't we fix it?" "No," I said gently. "We can't fix what you spent so long breaking on purpose." She started crying. Soft, fractured sobs, the kind that once would have cracked me open. But now they sounded far away, like something happening to someone I no longer recognized. "I'm sorry," she said over and over. "I'm so sorry, Mark." I closed my eyes, listening. There was sincerity in her voice, but it came too late. I'd spent years asking for that one sentence. Now it had no weight left. When she realized I wasn't responding, she whispered, "Please come home." I exhaled slowly. "Claire, I don't know where home is anymore, but it's not there." Modi, the silence that followed was different this time. Not defiant, not manipulative. It was defeated. Before hanging up, she said, "If you go, I'll never forgive myself." "You'll learn to," I replied softly, "just like I learned to forgive you long before you asked." After I ended the call, I sat in the dark for a long while, feeling the strange calm that comes when something ends without fireworks. Just a quiet, inevitable stillness. The next morning, she didn't call or text. The silence was almost jarring at first, but then it began to feel peaceful. There was no tension, no wait, just quiet. I walked into town again, bought a coffee, and sat by the window of a small cafe. The world looked different, not brighter, but simpler. People moved with ease, laughing, talking, living without the constant push and pull of emotional games. I realized then that love, at its purest, doesn't demand constant proof. It doesn't thrive on control or apology. It's mutual awareness, not dependency. I finished my coffee and drove up a winding road that overlooked the valley. From there, I could see the city in the distance, tiny, silent, bathed in afternoon light. For a long time I just sat there, thinking about how many years I'd wasted trying to be enough for someone who mistook effort for obligation. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I turned on my phone again. No missed calls, no messages. For once, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like balance, a space no longer filled by pleading or waiting or disappointment. I thought of her then, probably sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the same chair where I used to sit every morning. Maybe she finally understood that love doesn't die when someone leaves. It dies long before, in the moments when you treat the person beside you like they're already gone. That night, I wrote one final message. Take care of yourself, Claire. Don't call anymore. Let's both move forward. I didn't expect a reply. The phone stayed still, and for the first time in what felt like years, so did I. Peace doesn't always come wrapped in closure. Sometimes it arrives in the form of silence, not the kind used to wound, but the kind that frees you from ever needing to explain yourself again. That night, I fell asleep without thinking of her, and the quiet that filled the room didn't ache anymore. It simply was. And for me, that was enough. It's strange how absence can feel heavier than presence. When I left, I thought distance would feel light, a kind of freedom, clean and unburdened. But some nights the quiet pressed against me like gravity. Not regret exactly, just the ghost of routine, the echo of someone who used to fill space beside me. For the first few weeks I drifted between places, motels with thin walls, coffee shops that all smelled the same, highways that stretched endlessly across the map. Every new town was an attempt to overwrite the old one, to trade familiarity for anonymity. But memory has a cruel way of following you. It hides in ordinary details, a song playing in a gas station, a woman's perfume in a crowded diner, the sight of two people laughing without tension. It was in one of those diners, somewhere in northern Colorado, that I realized how numb I'd become. The waitress asked if I wanted my coffee refilled, and I didn't answer right away. My mind had wandered, not to Claire, but to the silence that had replaced her. It had started to feel comfortable, almost sacred. For years I'd begged for scraps of affection, thinking love required endurance. Now, in that diner, with the hum of conversation around me, I realized endurance had been the problem. I had mistaken pain for loyalty. I spent my days walking, long stretches of road that cut through small towns and farmlands. I watched people build lives, simple and steady, and I wondered if I'd ever know that kind of peace, the kind that doesn't demand constant explanation or apology. But the truth is, healing isn't cinematic. There's no dramatic breakthrough or perfect sunrise that suddenly makes everything clear. It's slow, uneven. Some mornings I woke up breathing easier. Others, I felt the pull of old habits, the urge to check my phone to see if she'd called again. One night, I dreamed of her. Not the bitter version, not the woman who used silence as a weapon, but the girl I met years ago, laughing, free, full of color. In the dream, she smiled at me across a crowded street, and for a moment, I believed she was still that person. Then I woke up to the dull hum of the motel heater and the ache that comes with remembering that some versions of people exist only in your memory, not in reality. Days blurred together. I started keeping a small journal, jotting down fragments, things I saw, things I felt, things I refused to forget. One page read, "She taught me how to chase love. I taught myself how to stop." The more I wrote, the less I thought about her. The more I remembered the things I'd given up, laughter, peace, curiosity, the more I began to reclaim them. Still, there were moments when guilt crept in. The human mind has a way of romanticizing even the worst parts once enough time passes. I'd remember her falling asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, or the way she'd hum without realizing it when she was happy. Then, almost as quickly, I'd remember the nights she'd pull away when I reached for her, the cold tone in her voice when she said, "I'm tired, not tonight," like affection was an errand she couldn't be bothered to run. Love doesn't die all at once. It erodes. You wake up one day and realize the foundation's been crumbling for years. I'd spent too long patching cracks that were never meant to hold. One afternoon, while filling up my truck at a gas station, I noticed a couple arguing near the pumps. It was quiet but tense. The woman's folded arms, the man's exhausted posture. I recognized it immediately. That wordless standoff where love and resentment blur into something heavy and habitual. I watched as they climbed into their car without resolving anything, their silence louder than any fight could have been. It hit me then. That used to be us, and I couldn't go back to that version of myself even if I tried. Weeks later, I rented a small cabin near a lake. It wasn't much. A single bed, a wood stove, a view of water that shifted color with the light. I spent my mornings writing and my evenings walking along the shore. It became my version of therapy, not forgetting her, but forgiving myself for staying so long in something that was already gone. Then one evening, as I sat by the lake, the phone rang again. Her number. I stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, her voice was calm, softer, quieter. "I just wanted to hear your voice," she said. "I didn't think you'd call again," I replied. "I wasn't going to," she admitted. "But I've been thinking a lot. About us. About what I did." I didn't respond right away. The air was cool, the sound of water steady. "I know I can't undo everything," she continued, "but I wish I could tell you that I finally understand. You weren't asking for too much. I was giving too little." Her words were sincere, but they didn't reach me the way they once would have. Maybe because I no longer needed them. "I'm glad you understand," I said quietly. "Do you hate me?" she asked. "No," I said. "I did for a while, but hating you kept me tied to you. I had to let that go." She was silent for a long moment. "Are you coming back?" I looked out at the water, the ripples catching the last of the sunlight. "No," I said finally. "I can't." She breathed out slowly. "I figured. I hope you find peace," I added. "You too," she whispered. We said goodbye, not dramatically, not bitterly, just two voices fading out, each knowing there was nothing left to salvage. When the call ended, I didn't feel sadness, just stillness. That night I stepped outside and looked up at the stars. The sky was clear, the air cool. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with anything. I thought about all the times I'd begged her to listen, all the explanations I'd given that never landed, and I realized something simple. People only hear you when they're ready to. Maybe she finally was, but I wasn't there anymore. I went back inside, poured a drink, and sat by the window. My reflection stared back at me, tired, older, but lighter somehow. I'd carried her absence long enough. Now it was time to carry myself. The following morning I woke up before dawn and drove to the nearest overlook. The world was quiet except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. As the first light broke over the horizon, I felt something inside me loosen, the last thread of the life I'd left behind. Love, I realized, doesn't always end with closure. Sometimes it just ends with understanding. And in that moment, watching the sunrise paint the lake gold, I understood everything I needed to. I wasn't escaping her anymore. I was returning to myself. It's strange how peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't roar or announce itself. It just shows up quietly one morning, like sunlight slipping through blinds, and you realize the war inside you has ended. That's how it felt the day I stopped missing her. It had been months since I left. The seasons had shifted. The sharp chill of early winter softened into a cool spring. I was living in a small coastal town by then, a place so calm it felt almost unreal compared to the chaos I'd known before. I rented a modest apartment above a bookstore that always smelled faintly of paper and salt. From my window, I could see the ocean, its rhythm patient and constant. Most mornings, I'd walk down to the pier with my coffee. I didn't think much during those walks. Not about her, not about what went wrong. I just breathed. The ocean has a way of humbling you. It reminds you that time keeps moving, no matter who stays or leaves. One morning, as I watched the tide crawl in, I realized that I hadn't thought about Claire in days, not out of bitterness, but because she no longer occupied every quiet corner of my mind. She'd become a story I once lived, not a wound I still carried. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with stillness, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. After everything, I'd learned something I wish I'd known years ago. Love isn't about how long you hold on. It's about knowing when to let go. Staying had turned both of us into strangers, pretending to be the people we once were. Leaving gave us back the chance to find out who we really were, without the noise. A few weeks later, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized her handwriting immediately. That neat, looping script that once filled birthday cards and shopping lists. My chest tightened as I held it, but I didn't open it right away. I left it on the kitchen counter for hours, staring at it between sips of coffee, as if the paper itself might tell me whether reading it would heal me or reopen everything I'd closed. When I finally unfolded it, her words were simple. Mark, I don't expect forgiveness. Not anymore. I just wanted to thank you for walking away when you did. You saved us from becoming something uglier. I've spent a lot of time reflecting, and I see now how much I mistook control for care, silence for strength. I wanted to win every argument, but in doing so, I lost you. I hope you're happy, truly, Claire. There was no plea to come back, no apology trying to disguise itself as manipulation. Just honesty. Maybe the first real honesty we'd shared in years. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not to revisit it, but to respect it, to acknowledge that closure sometimes arrives in quiet, graceful words, not in the dramatic scenes we imagine. That night I took a long walk down the beach. The sky was smeared with orange and lavender, the air cool and salty. I watched the waves break and retreat, endlessly repeating their rhythm. It struck me how much love resembled that motion, constant, changing, sometimes violent, sometimes still. It crashes, it retreats, and somehow it always returns in a different form. As I stood there, I thought about the man I had been when this all began, the one who begged, who bargained, who believed love meant endurance no matter the cost. I felt compassion for him, not shame. He didn't know better then. He thought staying proved strength. Now I knew that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to stop fighting for something that no longer fights for you. I didn't hate Claire anymore. In fact, I wished her well in the truest sense. I hoped she found herself again, the version that used to laugh without guilt, the one who wasn't afraid of being kind. Maybe she would. Maybe she already had. Weeks turned into months, and my life began to feel full again. Not busy, but alive. I made friends in town, started helping at the bookstore downstairs, and picked up photography again. I found beauty in small, unremarkable things. An old man feeding seagulls, a mother braiding her daughter's hair on a park bench, sunlight flickering on glass. Ordinary moments that used to blur into the background now felt sacred. And then, one afternoon, while developing some photos, I came across one I didn't remember taking. An empty chair on the porch of that cabin by the lake. The light had caught it just right, the wood glowing golden against the blue of the water. I stared at it for a long time, realizing that it somehow represented everything I'd come to understand. That absence could be beautiful too. The truth is, I didn't walk away from her out of pride. I did it out of love. Love for the life I still had left. Love for the man I was becoming. For years, I believed love was sacrifice. Now I knew it was balance, a two-way current, not a one-sided flood. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks of me, not with longing, but with that quiet recognition of someone who shaped her life in ways she can't explain. I think about her sometimes too. Not the arguments or the distance, but the moments before everything cracked. The way she laughed once at something I said, throwing her head back completely unguarded. That was real. That was us once. But love, like the ocean, doesn't belong to anyone. You can stand at the edge and let it wash over you, but you can't hold it in your hands. The harder you try, the faster it slips away. On my last night in that town, I sat by the window and watched a storm roll in. The wind howled through the cracks, the waves roared against the rocks, and for the first time, the chaos didn't unsettle me. It felt alive, a reminder that peace isn't the absence of storms, but learning not to fear them. I raised a glass to no one in particular and whispered, "Thank you, Claire." Not for the pain, but for the lesson. The next morning, I packed my things and drove toward a new city. The road stretched ahead, wide and gleaming in the early light. The world felt vast again, full of stories, of people I hadn't met yet, of chances I hadn't taken. As the skyline disappeared in my rearview mirror, I didn't look back. Not because I was running, but because I was finally ready to keep moving. What I'd once called the end was, in truth, just the middle of becoming someone new. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was free.